The opening scene is set in a humble diner, where the atmosphere is fast-paced and filled with the clattering of dishes. The staff, each busy with their own tasks, occasionally forget the presence of each other, or at times they simply work on autopilot, like wheels turning endlessly without ever stopping. The flickering neon lights reflect weakly off the tables and chairs, blending with the scent of strong coffee and the warm air from the toasters. Yet despite all this activity, something is missing. Something feels incomplete. In the corner of the diner sits a man who appears to be an ordinary customer. Wearing an old flannel shirt, his hair damp from the rain that just passed, his face marked with the traces of time. He doesn't pay much attention to the passing glances, and no one takes note of the quiet man sitting there. Beneath the name tag that reads Walt Simmons, he is not someone anyone in this diner would recognize. But the truth is, this man is no stranger. Thomas Hale, the founder of Sunrise Diner, is the one who built this place from the ground up, creating a space he hoped would be a second home for hardworking people, where their efforts were truly appreciated. They, the ones who sweat and toil each day to serve customers, are rarely rewarded for their hard work. In fact, few know the truth. Those who work the hardest never see the tips they deserve. Sitting there, Thomas is not just a customer in the diner. He is listening, observing. Every whisper, every conversation is something he wouldn't have heard if he hadn't been sitting here among the very people he once hoped to offer a better opportunity to. One of the conversations he overhears from two nearby servers goes, "It doesn't matter who serves, the tips always go in one direction." The words are spoken with no surprise or anger. They speak a truth that no one dares face: the unfair distribution of tips. Sitting in silence, Thomas can't help but feel shaken. He looks around, seeing the staff busy with their tasks, but their eyes seem all too accustomed to scarcity, silently accepting it. The tired steps, the automatic gestures, all void of passion, void of hope. Everything is done out of habit, but there's one person who stands out to him: Elena Brooks, a server who Thomas notices for the way she works. She is not in a hurry, not avoiding anything, but every movement of hers is full of care, respect, and attention to every customer, even though they may never know who she is. She doesn't need to speak much. Her actions alone make the difference. From afar, Thomas watches her, a deep feeling stirring within him. If this place cannot take care of workers like her, then Sunrise Diner is nothing but lifeless numbers on paper, he thinks. And then he makes a decision. He will no longer stay silent. He will do something to change this. When Elena entered the kitchen, Thomas couldn't take his eyes off her. Though she didn't stand out in any particular way, he sensed something different in every movement she made. A difference not just in her work, but also in the way she handled difficulties without complaining. Everyone said working at Sunrise Diner was just a regular job, nothing special. They simply served customers, collected tips, and went home at the end of the day. But Elena was different. She walked a different path, living and working with a clear purpose: to do her job the best she could, whether anyone noticed or not. Thomas noticed this the moment she placed a coffee cup on the table. She didn't just perform the duties of a waitress, she was performing the work of someone with self-respect and a responsibility for even the smallest of tasks. She gently placed the coffee cup before Thomas. No need to say much, no need for anything extra. The way she took care of the smallest details, like a piece of butter or a jam packet on the side, was the kind of attention that others in the diner never bothered with. To her, nothing was just done. Everything had a reason. And it was in these small acts that Thomas recognized the kind of care and respect he had wanted to bring to this diner, but that the system had forgotten. A light conversation took place between them. Thomas spoke calmly, though there was curiosity in his voice. "Looks like it's a busy morning, huh? The tips should be decent, right?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She stood there for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the tables, then met Thomas's eyes, not with excitement or surprise, but with a calmness that was almost eerie. She responded in a voice soft, yet clear enough for him to hear. "Tips? They don't go to everyone. They usually just go one way." Her words weren't filled with anger, nor were they accusations. They were simply an acknowledgement of a reality she had grown accustomed to. Thomas couldn't help but feel a pang in his chest. How could a place built on the belief in fairness and hard work become one where that very fairness was forgotten. And especially for people like Elena, those who truly worked, not just for money, but because they believed in what they were doing. After hearing this, Thomas took a sip of his coffee and looked at Elena more closely. He didn't feel anger, but there was a weight in his heart, a sense of urgency, a resolve. "So, what should we do to change this?" Thomas asked. Elena didn't answer right away. She pursed her lips, still carrying the tray across the tables. But in her eyes, Thomas saw a glimmer of something new. She wasn't just working to make a living, she was working for something larger, fairness that she had longed for. And at that moment, in the silence between the two of them, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't continue watching things go on like this. He had to do something now to change the lives of the workers here, so they no longer had to live in silent resentment and quietly endure. "Elena," he said with a seriousness she'd never heard from him before, "this system needs to change, and I'll be the one to stand up and change it." Thomas sat still, staring at the now cold coffee cup in front of him. Everything around him continued as normal, but in his mind a storm was brewing. He could no longer sit idly by and watch this injustice continue. People like Elena, who gave their all but never received the recognition they deserved, couldn't be overlooked any longer. They weren't just missing money, they were missing the respect, the acknowledgement that they had rightfully earned. The name Sunrise Diner was more than just a restaurant. It was meant to be a symbol of faith in a place where everyone could contribute, work, and be valued fairly. But now this very place was nurturing a system that was eroding those values. Thomas had become accustomed to boardroom meetings, business strategies, numbers, and targets. But this was the first time he truly felt the pain of those who worked tirelessly, yet would never be recognized, no matter how much effort they put in. He couldn't wait any longer, waiting for the numbers in the reports to change on their own, waiting for people to realize their mistakes by themselves. He had to act immediately. "Elena," he called out to her as she passed by with a tray full of food. She stopped, glancing at him, her eyes not tired but full of curiosity. "What's on your mind?" Elena asked, her voice still calm, but now carrying a hint of expectation. "We need to change the way things are done here," Thomas said, his gaze unwavering. "I can't keep watching people like you work so hard without being acknowledged. This system has to change." Elena didn't answer right away. She simply stood there looking at him, her lips pursed, still holding the tray steady in her hands. She had heard many promises of change before, but those were always just words, never backed by action. Yet in Thomas's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before, a seriousness, a resolve that made her feel there was more to this than just talk. "Are you serious?" she asked, a touch of disbelief in her voice, but also a glimmer of hope. "You're not just saying this, are you?" Thomas smiled, though it was more determined than gentle. "Yes, I am serious. I won't let you or anyone else here continue to work without getting the recognition you deserve. From now on, everyone's work will be acknowledged fairly." Elena took a deep breath. She felt like she was standing at a crossroads. Part of her wanted to believe in what Thomas was saying. She wanted to believe that the sacrifices of people like her would finally be recognized. But the doubt still lingered. Could he really make this change? The system had been in place for so long. Could it be undone just like that? "You really think you can do this?" she asked, no longer skeptical but cautious, her voice softer now. Thomas stood up slowly and walked toward the counter. He wasn't in a rush, but his eyes held a quiet determination. "We're going to start today. Every tip will be credited to the right person. Every effort will be counted. No one will be overlooked anymore." Elena stood still, her gaze fixed on him. She didn't speak, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she could feel the possibility of change. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. And in that moment, Thomas made up his mind. He would no longer wait for things to change on their own. He would make it happen, starting now. He wasn't going to let another day go by where the people who worked hardest were ignored, where their contributions went unnoticed. The next morning, there was no loud announcement or official proclamation. Thomas quietly entered the diner, still wearing the same simple shirt he had worn the day before. He sat in a corner where he could observe everything, watching as people went about their work, unaware that a significant change was about to take place. Elena entered the diner, not noticing any immediate change in the atmosphere. She moved through the tables, carrying plates of food, pouring coffee for customers, just as she always did, with her hands constantly moving and her eyes too familiar with the exhaustion of her job. But today there was something different. She felt Thomas's eyes on her as she passed by. Perhaps for the first time she sensed that he was waiting for her to do something, as if he was expecting a shift, something she hadn't felt before. "Good morning," Thomas spoke casually, though there was a quiet sincerity in his voice. "Thank you for everything you've done." Elena stopped for a moment, surprised by his words. She had always been just another employee, another person in the hustle and bustle of the diner. Why would he thank her? It wasn't anything extraordinary, just another regular day of work. "Thank you?" she repeated, her voice tinged with amusement. "It's just another day at work." "No, today is not just another day," Thomas said, his gaze steady and serious. "I want you to know that from today, everything will change here. We will start a new system where everyone's work will be properly recognized. No one will be forgotten. No one will be undervalued anymore." Elena paused, standing still for a moment, unsure of what to make of his words. She had heard many promises of change before, but all those promises had faded with time. They were never followed through. But in Thomas's eyes, she saw a seriousness she hadn't seen before. He wasn't joking. "Are you serious?" she asked, narrowing her eyes, trying to find any sign of sarcasm. "You're not just talking, are you?" Thomas smiled, but there was a firmness in his expression. "Yes, I'm serious. I won't let you or anyone else continue to work without being properly acknowledged. From now on, everyone will be seen. Everyone will be rewarded accordingly. No one will be overlooked, and no one will be exploited again." Elena stood there, her hand still holding the tray, her mind racing with uncertainty. Could this really happen? Could Thomas really bring about the change he was promising? She had no idea, but the fact that he was willing to take action, rather than just speaking empty words, sparked something inside her. "Do you really think you can do this?" she asked, no longer skeptical but open to the possibility. Thomas stood up slowly, walking toward the counter. There was no rush in his steps, but his eyes spoke volumes. He was resolute. "We will begin today. Every tip will be allocated to the right person. Every effort will be counted. Everyone will be recognized for their hard work." Elena didn't answer immediately. She just stood there looking at him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. But all she found was determination. She didn't know if it was possible, but for the first time in a long while, she could feel something stirring inside her. Could it be that change was finally possible? "All right," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of hope and doubt. "Let's see if you can really make it happen." Thomas turned around and looked at the rest of the staff. He didn't say anything else, but his gaze conveyed everything that needed to be said. The changes had already begun, and now it was up to them all to make it happen. As he left the diner, he knew he had made the right decision. This wasn't just about changing a system. It was about giving people the recognition and respect they deserved. It was about making Sunrise Diner a place where hard work was valued and fairness was the standard. The next day, Sunrise Diner continued its usual rhythm. Coffee was still being poured, bread was still being served, and people continued to move through the cramped space with tired footsteps. But today, there was something different. A subtle change, not in the physical environment, but in the way people carried themselves and interacted with one another. Elena walked through the diner, holding the familiar tray, but this time, she didn't feel as though she was walking in the shadows. Every step she took, every gesture she made, felt like a declaration of her newfound value. She no longer looked down at the ground, no longer avoided eye contact. She had been seen. She was now a part of something that valued her, not just as a worker, but as a person. Travis, who had once been the one in control of the tips, the one who manipulated the system to his advantage, was now sitting quietly at the counter. He no longer hovered over the POS screen, watching everything with an air of superiority. Today, he was just like everyone else. Every so often, he glanced around, his eyes searching, perhaps looking for the old power he once held. But that power was gone, and he seemed uncertain of what his role was now. Elena didn't pay him much attention. She continued her work, but there was a noticeable change in the way she carried herself. The other staff members, too, no longer walked in silence or feared that their efforts might go unrecognized. The new system Thomas had promised had begun to take shape. Everyone's work was being acknowledged, and it was no longer a game or a manipulation by a few. Everyone was part of this system, and everyone would be seen. The change wasn't just in the distribution of tips. It was in the way the staff looked at one another, in the way they walked through the diner with more confidence, in the way they interacted with customers. There was a new sense of self-respect and dignity among them. No longer were they invisible or unheard, they were valued. Thomas sat in his usual corner, watching it all unfold. He didn't need to say anything, for the results were already visible. The atmosphere had changed. The diner was no longer just a place to serve food, it was a place where everyone's effort, no matter how small, was recognized. And that, for Thomas, was enough. He had made a difference, and that difference was beginning to be felt by everyone. Elena no longer felt like just another employee. She felt like a part of something bigger, something fair, something that had long been absent. She wasn't fighting against an unjust system anymore. She was working within one that acknowledged her and her contributions. As Thomas watched, he felt a sense of pride. The changes he had hoped for were no longer just ideas or promises. They were becoming a reality. The diner, once a place of silent struggle, was now a place of fairness. The staff was not just working for tips, they were working because they were seen. They were working because they mattered. For Travis, it was a different story. He may have continued to work at the counter, but the certainty with which he had once controlled the system was gone. He was no longer in control, and the others were beginning to see him for who he truly was. The power he had once held was now just a shadow of what it had been. But no one seemed to mind. The real power, the true change, was happening among the staff. They no longer had to worry about whether their work was seen. They knew it was, and that made all the difference. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun. It was a long road ahead, but this was the first step in making Sunrise Diner a place of fairness, respect, and recognition for everyone. And Thomas knew that the journey had only just begun. The next day, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere at Sunrise Diner. Everything appeared the same on the surface, but there was a tangible difference in the way people worked and interacted with one another. Elena entered the diner, holding the familiar tray. But this time, she didn't feel like she was walking in the shadows anymore. Every step, every action felt like a statement of her newfound worth. She no longer looked down or avoided eye contact with others. She was being seen, recognized, not just as an employee, but as a person. Travis, who had once controlled the tips and manipulated the system to his advantage, was now sitting quietly at the counter. He no longer hovered over the POS screen, exerting power over the others. Today, he was just another worker, like everyone else. He glanced around occasionally as if searching for the control he once had, but it was gone. He seemed uncertain of his place in this new system. Elena didn't pay much attention to him. She continued with her work, but there was a clear difference in the way she moved. The other staff members, too, no longer seemed worried about whether their efforts would go unrecognized. The new system that Thomas had promised was starting to take effect. Everyone's work was now being acknowledged, and the power dynamics that had once defined the diner were no longer in play. The change wasn't just about the fair distribution of tips. It was about the way the staff interacted with one another and with the customers. There was a new confidence, a new self-respect in the air. No longer were they invisible. They were seen. They were valued. Thomas sat in his usual corner, quietly observing everything. He didn't need to speak. He was already seeing the results of the change he had set in motion. The atmosphere had shifted. Sunrise Diner was no longer just a place where people worked to serve food. It had become a place where every effort, big or small, was acknowledged. And for Thomas, that was enough. He had made a difference, and that difference was now being felt by everyone. Elena no longer felt like just another worker. She felt like a part of something bigger, something fair. She didn't have to fight against an unjust system anymore. She was now working within a system that saw her, valued her, and recognized her contributions. As Thomas watched this unfold, he felt a deep sense of pride. The changes he had envisioned were no longer just ideas. They were becoming a reality. The diner was no longer a place of silent struggle. It was a place of fairness. The staff weren't just working for tips. They were working because they mattered. They were working because they were valued. For Travis, things were different. Though he continued to stand at the counter, the confidence that had once been so apparent in his actions was gone. The power he had held was now slipping away, and the other staff members were beginning to see him for who he really was. The system he had once controlled was now gone, replaced by one that valued everyone's contribution. But no one seemed to mind. The real change was happening among the staff. They were no longer concerned with whether their work would be seen. They knew it would be, and that made all the difference. This transformation was only the beginning. It wasn't complete yet, but it was a significant first step toward making Sunrise Diner a place of fairness, respect, and recognition for everyone. And Thomas knew this was just the start of a long journey toward building a truly just workplace. The next morning, the atmosphere at Sunrise Diner had changed completely. The employees walked into the diner with a new sense of confidence, and the way they interacted with one another had shifted. Everything seemed the same, but there was something different, something that had changed within each person. Elena entered the diner, carrying the familiar tray, but this time she didn't feel like she was walking in the shadows anymore. Every step she took, every action she made, felt like a declaration of her worth. She no longer avoided eye contact or looked down when she interacted with the customers. She stood tall. She had been recognized not just as a worker, but as a human being with value. Travis, still standing behind the counter, no longer exuded the same sense of superiority. His earlier confidence had faded. Although he was still at the POS screen, the power he once wielded was no longer there. He glanced around, a little more anxious now, but there was nothing left for him to control. The system had shifted, and he could no longer manipulate it. Elena didn't pay him much attention. She continued with her tasks, but there was a clear difference in the way she moved. The other employees, too, no longer seemed anxious or uncertain. They knew that their efforts were recognized. The new system Thomas had promised was in full effect. Every contribution was acknowledged, and the imbalance of power that had once existed was no longer in play. This change wasn't just about the fair distribution of tips. It was about the way everyone interacted, the way they respected each other, and the way they now saw their own worth. There was an air of self-respect and dignity that hadn't been there before. No longer were the employees invisible. They were seen, they were valued. Thomas sat quietly in his usual corner, observing it all unfold. He didn't need to say anything. The results were already clear. The diner had transformed from just a place where people worked to serve food into a place where every individual's efforts were recognized. For Thomas, that was enough. He had made a difference, and that difference was now being felt by everyone in the diner. Elena no longer felt like just another employee. She was part of something bigger, something fair. She was no longer fighting an unjust system. She was now working in a place where her efforts mattered, where she was acknowledged for the value she brought to the diner. As Thomas observed the changes, he felt a deep sense of pride. The vision he had for the diner was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. The diner was no longer a place of silent struggle. It was now a place of fairness. The staff weren't just working for tips. They were working because they knew their contributions mattered. They were working because they were valued. For Travis, it was a different story. Although he still stood at the counter, there was no longer the arrogance or sense of control he once had. His power was slipping away, and the other employees were starting to see him for who he truly was. The system he had once manipulated was gone, replaced by one that valued everyone's contributions equally. But no one seemed to care. The true power, the real change, was happening among the employees. They no longer had to wonder if their work was being seen. They knew it was, and that made all the difference. This change was just the beginning. It wasn't complete yet, but it was a significant first step toward making Sunrise Diner a place of fairness, respect, and recognition for everyone. And Thomas knew this was only the start of a long journey toward building a truly just and equal workplace. The next day, the atmosphere at Sunrise Diner was still the same in many ways, but there was something different in every step, every glance between the staff members. Thomas didn't need to say anything more. He had done what was necessary, and the results were beginning to show. Although the struggle for justice couldn't be fully achieved overnight, he knew that a significant step had been taken. Now everything was beginning to truly change. Elena entered the diner, no longer carrying the same heavy burden she once did. She moved through the space with more confidence, no longer looking down or avoiding eye contact with her coworkers. She had been seen by herself, by her colleagues, and by Thomas. Every step she took now felt like a declaration of her self-worth, and she was no longer invisible. The other staff members too had begun to change. They no longer hesitated or worried about whether their hard work would be acknowledged. No one had to work in silence. No one had to quietly wonder if their contributions would be taken for granted. Everyone now knew that their work was valued. The new system Thomas had promised was in full motion. Every contribution was recognized. There was no more manipulation by a few individuals who controlled the system. Travis, still standing at the counter, was no longer the same person. His once obvious arrogance had faded. Although he still sat behind the POS screen, it no longer represented the power he once held. Instead, he seemed lost, unsure of his role. His earlier sense of control was gone, and he couldn't stop the transformation that had already begun. The system had changed, and his ability to manipulate it had vanished. Elena didn't pay him much attention. She simply went about her work. But it was clear she no longer felt like a part of a system that overlooked her. She was no longer a cog in the wheel. She was now a valued part of the team, and so were all her colleagues. The shift was in the air, and everyone could feel it. Thomas sat in his usual corner, observing the quiet but powerful change. He didn't need to say anything more. He had already seen what he wanted to see. The diner had shifted from a place where people worked simply to serve food to a place where every individual's effort was recognized. For Thomas, that was enough. He had achieved the change he sought, and the results were already evident. Elena no longer felt like just another worker. She was now part of something greater, something fair. She no longer had to fight against an unfair system. She was now working in a place where her contributions were recognized. She felt valued, and that made all the difference. As Thomas watched the transformation, he felt a deep sense of pride. The changes he had hoped for were no longer just an idea. They were becoming a reality. The diner was no longer a place of silent struggles. It was now a place of fairness. The employees were not just working for tips. They were working because they knew their efforts were important. They were working because they knew they mattered. For Travis, the reality was different. He still stood behind the counter, but the self-satisfaction he once had was gone. The power he had once wielded was no longer there, and he was forced to face the truth. The system he had manipulated was now gone, replaced by one that recognized everyone's worth. But no one seemed to mind. The real power, the true change, was happening among the staff. They no longer had to wonder if their work was noticed. They knew it was, and that made all the difference. This transformation wasn't complete, but it was a significant first step toward creating a truly fair, respectful, and equal environment at Sunrise Diner. And Thomas knew this was just the beginning of a long journey toward building a truly just workplace. The new day began, but everything at Sunrise Diner had changed. Each step taken by the employees felt more confident, and their interactions with each other no longer carried the hesitation or anxiety of the past. The diner was still the same in many ways, but something deep within the atmosphere had shifted. Elena walked through the diner, tray in hand, but this time she didn't feel burdened. Every step, every movement she made now radiated a sense of dignity and self-assurance. She no longer kept her head down, no longer avoided eye contact with her colleagues. She was seen. She was no longer invisible. She stood tall, no longer just another worker, but a valued part of the team. The other staff members, too, no longer hesitated or feared that their efforts would go unnoticed. The system Thomas had promised was fully in effect. Every contribution, every effort was recognized. No one was being overlooked anymore, and the power struggles of the past had faded away. It wasn't just about tips anymore. It was about being valued as a person and as a worker. Travis, still standing behind the counter, was a different person. His previous air of arrogance and superiority had faded. While he continued to work at the POS screen, his power was gone. He glanced around, seemingly uncertain of his place now, as if realizing the control he once had was no longer his. The system had shifted, and his manipulation was no longer a part of it. Elena didn't pay much attention to him. She went about her work, but there was a clear difference in how she moved and interacted with the others. She wasn't just doing her job, she was taking pride in it. The others felt the same way. The system had changed, and everyone was a part of it. Thomas sat in his usual corner, observing everything with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to say anything more. The results were already evident. The diner had transformed from just a place where people worked to serve food into a place where each individual's effort was recognized. For Thomas, this was enough. He had made a difference, and it was now being felt by everyone. Elena no longer felt like just another employee. She was part of something bigger, something fair. She didn't have to fight against an unjust system anymore. She worked in a place where her contributions were valued and acknowledged. As Thomas observed the changes, he felt a deep sense of pride. The vision he had for the diner was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. The diner was no longer a place of silent struggles. It was now a place of fairness. The employees weren't just working for tips. They were working because they knew their efforts were valued. They were working because they knew they mattered. For Travis, it was a different story. He still stood at the counter, but the self-satisfaction he once had was gone. The power he once wielded was slipping away, and the other staff members were beginning to see him for who he truly was. The system he had once controlled had crumbled, replaced by one that acknowledged everyone's worth. But no one seemed to mind. The real change, the real power, was happening among the staff. They no longer had to wonder if their work was seen. They knew it was, and that made all the difference. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was a crucial first step. Sunrise Diner was now on its way to becoming a truly fair, respectful, and equal place for everyone. And Thomas knew this was just the beginning of a long journey toward creating a just workplace. As the morning went on and sunlight began to shine through the diner's windows, the atmosphere at Sunrise Diner had noticeably changed. Everything appeared the same. Cups clinking, the hiss of the coffee machine in the background. But the real change had occurred inside each person. From the new employees to the long-standing staff, no one felt invisible anymore. No one had to work in the shadows of an unjust system. Elena stood by the counter, wiping down the surface, glancing at the POS screen. This time everything was different. The numbers that appeared on the screen were no longer just faceless figures. They now represented names, employees who had been recognized for their work. She no longer had to jot down everything in a small notebook. No longer did she have to silently fight against a system that disregarded her efforts. Every step she took, every decision she made, was seen and valued. She wasn't just a worker anymore. She was a valued part of the team. Travis stood behind the counter, but there was a clear difference. His earlier self-satisfaction, his feeling of superiority, was gone. The power he had once held was no longer his. The employees, who had once been at his mercy, now worked in a system where their efforts were acknowledged. The light from the POS screen no longer gave him the upper hand. It had become just another tool, no longer a weapon of control. Thomas sat in his usual corner, quietly observing. He didn't need to say anything more. The results spoke for themselves. The diner had transformed. It was no longer just a place where food was served. It had become a place where every effort, every contribution was acknowledged. For Thomas, that was enough. The change he had worked for was now happening, and he could see it in every interaction, in the way the staff moved with more confidence, in the way they treated each other with newfound respect. Elena no longer felt like just another employee. She was part of something bigger, something just. She no longer had to fight against an unjust system. She now worked in a place where her contributions were seen, where her value was recognized. As Thomas observed the changes, he felt a quiet pride. The vision he had for the diner was no longer just an idea, it was becoming reality. The diner was no longer a place of silent struggle. It was now a place of fairness, where every employee felt valued. They weren't just working for tips. They were working because they knew their efforts mattered. For Travis, it was different. He still stood at the counter, but the arrogance and sense of control he once had faded. He could no longer manipulate the system. The shift had happened, and he had to accept it. He wasn't in control anymore. The workers were now part of a system that valued their contributions, and he could do nothing but watch. But no one seemed to mind. The real power, the real change, had shifted to the staff. They no longer worried about whether their work would be seen. They knew it would be. And that made all the difference. The transformation was just beginning. It wasn't complete yet, but it was a vital first step toward making Sunrise Diner a truly fair, respectful, and equal place. Thomas knew this was just the beginning of a long journey toward creating a truly just workplace. He stood up from his seat, preparing to leave the diner. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just a quiet sense of accomplishment and pride. As he walked out of the diner, he knew that this was the beginning of something important. The change he had set in motion wasn't about grand speeches or gestures. It was about real, tangible change, the kind that happens when people are seen for who they are and the work they do. Today wasn't the end. It was the start of a new chapter, not just for Sunrise Diner, but for all the people who worked there. The change wasn't a far-off ideal anymore. It had become a reality. And that, to Thomas, was the most important thing. The journey toward fairness, respect, and recognition had only just begun. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.